All right, let's talk about this new lead-based paint form because there's some changes to it and there's going to be some confusion with the changes. And so I want to just try to help sort through that so you know exactly how to handle this new lead-based paint form. There are three major things I want to talk about with regards to the lead-based paint form changes. The first two are pretty straightforward, but the third one is the one where we're going to have some difficulties and some misunderstandings. So stick with me to the end so you get all three components of what's changed on this lead-based paint form. So first of all, when we look at the lead-based paint form, we know there are three components to it. The first one is the seller disclosure part. The second one is the purchaser's acknowledgement. And the third one is the agent's acknowledgement. And there are changes to each one of these that we have to go through so that we get it right. All right, so let's start with the seller's disclosure piece of this. And I've got the form pulled up here. And this part's pretty straightforward. The only thing that's changed on this is that before we would have the seller check a box as to what their disclosure is. But now what we're going to do is have the seller's initial. So not a major change, but something to be aware of if you're used to having sellers check the boxes. Well, now we're going to have them do their initials instead of checking the box. Now that's not going to really substantively change the application of the form, but the second change is actually that's a noteworthy deal that will change how we fill it out. So most of the time, we probably encounter that a seller has no reports or records pertaining to lead-based paint. That's generally what we find, is that sellers don't have anything, so they're going to initial this box. Now, our old lead-based paint form only had one option for the purchaser's acknowledgement, and that was that the purchaser acknowledges they've received copies of everything above. That was the only option, and that created a lot of confusion because the question was, if the buyer hasn't received anything, are they still going to go ahead and acknowledge just to say that, like, yeah, I recognize the seller doesn't have anything and I acknowledge that I've received that, even though receiving it is nothing? Well, it's cleared up now because the change adds in a second option where the purchaser can now acknowledge that they have not received any records and reports regarding lead-based paint. So this is great. The buyer or the seller, first of all, is typically going to say, hey, I don't have any reports. And now the purchaser can come back in and say, yeah, I've not received anything. Okay, the third thing, this last piece that deals with the agent disclosure, that's the one that's going to cause some confusion. This is the one that you really need to pay attention here so you know exactly whether you as the agent need to initial either of these boxes that we have below. So what's new here is really dealing with the purchaser's agent initials here. So we've always had this where the listing agent is going to acknowledge that they're going to initial here and they're going to say, hey, yeah, I'm going to sign this form that I have informed the seller of their obligation to disclose lead-based paint. I'm going to ensure compliance because I'm working with the seller. I have a contract with them. They're paying me, so I'm going to make sure I do my job. That's how the lead-based paint regulations work. Now they've added in a second option, okay? And the second option here is for the purchasers, the buyer's agent, to do the same thing, to say, hey, the buyer's agent has informed the seller of their obligations, the seller's obligation, to disclose the lead-based paint and that they're going to take responsibility for ensuring compliance. And now they've added in this language of only if the purchaser's agent receives compensation from the seller. But I want to clarify that a little bit because the way we do compensation now is a little bit different. So let's dig into the actual lead-based paint disclosure rules to get the definition of agent and why that matters for whether you as the buyer's agent need to disclose or not. Change is constant in the real estate industry, whether it's a change to the Real Estate Commission regulations, the contracts, federal regulations, all kinds of stuff. And when you're in the middle of a transaction, sometimes you need an answer and you need it quick and you want to make sure that it's a reliable answer when you get it. Well, that's what we do in our RPro Access community. We have a small community for real estate agents and brokers in the state of Oklahoma where we can help you get those things that you need to get your transactions to the closing table. If that's something that might be interesting to you, why don't you head on over to rproaccess.com and take a look at what we're doing, because we're looking to add just a few more agents to it before the end of this quarter. Okay, so looking at the Code of Federal Regulations, this is the actual law dealing with lead-based paint disclosure. And I'm going to come down here and I'm going to look at the definition of agent here. An agent means, because if you fall within this definition of agent, then that means that you have to initial here and ensure compliance. If you don't meet this definition, then you don't have to do that. So it says that it's a party who enters into a contract with a seller, including any party who enters into a contract with the representative of the seller. This is the key component here. So if you are an agent entering into a contract directly with the seller, which would be a listing agent, typically having a listing agreement with the seller, or a party who enters into a contract with the representative of the seller. So that could actually be as a buyer's agent. If you entered into a contract with the listing agent, then you would be required to ensure compliance, so on and so forth. Now, it does have an exception here that this does not apply to the purchaser themselves, because obviously the buyer's entering into a contract with the seller, but it also exempts any purchaser's representative, so a buyer's agent, who receives all compensation from the purchaser. So how do we kind of reconcile this and whether the buyer's agent is required to meet this definition and initial that blank or not? Well, I think in the vast majority of your typical transactions, you are not going to be required to initial that as the buyer's agent. Here's why. Because it says an agent is a party who enters into a contract with a seller. Are you, as the buyer's agent, entering into a contract with the seller? The answer is no, not in a typical traditional transaction. What about this? Are you entering into a contract with a representative of the seller? Are you entering into a contract with the listing agent? And again, in today's time, the vast majority of transactions, your typical transaction, the answer is no, you're not. And because of that, you are not entering into a contract with the seller. You're not entering into a contract with the listing agent. That means no, you are not required to initial as the buyer's agent. Okay, let's run through a couple of other but what abouts, some what ifs. So in most transactions we're seeing now, what's typically happened for compensation, because they do discuss compensation here, the buyer is asking in the purchase contract for the seller to pay the agent. Now that might look like it meets this definition because it's talking about compensation and the form says if you're getting paid by the seller, but that's different because the actual regulation, the law says you have to be entering into a contract with the seller or the seller's agent. And you're not doing that. The buyer is. The buyer's entering into a contract with them, not you, the buyer's agent. So in that case, even though you might be getting paid by the seller through the negotiated transaction between the buyer and the seller, you are not a party to that transaction. You're not a party to that contract, which in my view of what the definition of agent is, you don't meet it because you don't have an actual contract with the seller or the listing agent. Now, if we look at the old way of doing business, when we used to have an offer of compensation in the MLS, now that would actually create a contractual relationship between you, the buyer's agent, and the listing agent. That's the way those rules worked. But that's different now. We don't have that contractual relationship directly with the listing broker. Instead, it's the buyer entering into a contract with the seller. You, as the buyer's agent, don't have a contract with the listing agent or the seller. So in that circumstance, my view of this definition of agent is you don't meet it because you don't have a contractual relationship with the seller or the seller's agent, which means you don't have to acknowledge and ensure compliance on the lead-based paint disclosure. Now, there could be a circumstance where that does happen. Perhaps you have a for sale by owner and you actually enter into a written contractual agreement with the seller to say, hey, seller, you're going to compensate me, the buyer's agent. It's possible that happens. although most likely we're still just going to put it in the contract and it's between the buyer and the seller. So in the vast majority of cases, and I guess broker to broker compensation is still legal. I mean, you could do it. You could theoretically have a contractual arrangement with the listing broker, in which case, yes, you would be required to initial. But without those circumstances coming up, I think in the vast majority of cases, the buyer's agent is not going to need to enter into that lead-based paint disclosure initials, simply because they don't meet the definition of agent. Now, here's what you can expect. Many, many times when you are working with a buyer, the listing agent is likely going to ask you to initial it and sign it. I do not believe that you have to. Is it the end of the world if you do? Probably not, because we know that the lead-based paint disclosure is happening. But here's the deal. If you initial that, then you are initialing that you are ensuring compliance with the Lead-Based Paint Act and that you have informed the seller of their obligations, which you're not going to do. I mean, you're not actually going to be talking to the seller. And so, my thought is, I don't meet the definition. I'm not required to sign it or initial it. So I'm not going to. And so maybe this video will be a helpful resource for people so that maybe we'll get everybody on the same page, and hopefully there'll be some clarification there for everybody that's a little more broadly distributed so that we can get everybody on the same page to know when a buyer's agent should and should not initial that lead-based paint disclosure.